So I'm currently in a meeting waiting for some of my student participants to sign on. And I wanted to check in and just let you know how the project is going and what some of the conversations have been like with me and Schwinn. The first thing I want to point out is that I was really lucky to be assigned to a partner who has, and there we go. We had one sign in. So I'm going to stop recording briefly and then I will switch back on. Okay, now we're recording again. And I have Julio Roldan who just signed in. And what we are doing is we are basically just making sure that if Emily Vargas, who is the other student who is thinking about participating, if she is able to sign in late, then she will. But if not, she'll at least have this video to be able to refer to. So she's on the same page as us and she knows kind of what's going on. Okay. So just to kind of introduce the overview of the project, I think the idea behind what Stanford was trying to accomplish was to promote this project called Everyone Included. I believe this is some research that they came up with. I think it's proprietary. And the whole point is to get healthcare professionals and patients at the same level so that they can actually talk about what the reality of the situation is without there being this weird power play that's kind of always.
Yeah.
And
yeah, you can see that a lot.
Yeah, unfortunately, the power dynamics exist in part, I think, because of the way our medical system has been kind of created and how it runs, where you have different levels of education, different levels of things that are within people's clinical scope. And so it kind of by default creates a hierarchy. And since it's a knowledge-based hierarchy, the patient is usually at the bottom, unfortunately. And so sometimes we overlook what's really important to them because either they don't know how to express it in terms that, healthcare people are able and willing to listen. Sometimes it takes them too long to get to the point, and we're so limited by how much time we can spend with patients that if you're uncomfortable or embarrassed and it takes you a half an hour to describe to me your issue, I don't have time for that. So I'm going to ask you more targeted, specific questions when we're doing a thing called a history and an H&P, which is what you do every time a new patient comes in.
Can you repeat that again? It kind of broke up.
No, that's okay. It's called a history and physical. So whenever you have, and it's abbreviated to be H&P, and whenever a new patient comes in, or you haven't seen them for a little while, you'll do this comprehensive history and physical, where you get their background, their family history, all their vital signs, everything that kind of gives you a clear picture of where the person is health-wise. But you rarely have time to do that every single visit. You're going to do probably one comprehensive H&P, and then every subsequent visit will be very targeted to whatever problem they're having. And either medication refills or, some sort of trauma or some sort of infection, you're going to focus specifically on that issue, which means there's not a lot of space for preventive care because if things aren't a problem, you're not going to address them. It also means that sometimes issues that are more personal don't come up.
Oh, that's true.
And it also means that psychological issues aren't usually addressed unless there's actual risk. So if their mental health has gotten to a place where it's noticeable to you in the 10 minutes you're talking to them, then you might question it. But otherwise, you're not going to really kind of dig in and see how they are. So usually
so they won't come up to you.
Yeah, well, they won't. If they're there because they have to renew their medication, but they've been sleeping more lately and they're feeling depressed and maybe they're going through a breakup and maybe, unless their sleeplessness is something they mention and you probe, unless they've lost weight because they're not eating, a lot of this stuff is going to you're going to kind of miss it. And so their depression may be something really significant, but you may not notice it until it's already advanced to the point where they're considering self-harm, right? So you really want to be able to catch things in advance. And when we're talking about chronic illness, you definitely want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on their kind of holistic health, their nutrition, their mental well-being, their socialization, their spiritual health, all these different aspects that help them kind of survive this lifelong illness. So, and I know I'm going fast, Tony. We definitely have this recording. So
no. I got it all. I'm just thinking about like what do you mean by holistic? Because I heard holistic health.
Holistic is it's a word that's been a little corrupted lately in modern times. It sounds kind of like fake medicine, but really holistic approach is it's based on the word like holism, and it's about recognizing that human beings are more than their physical health. There's a mental health component, there's an emotional health component, there's a spiritual health component, and there's an impact that comes from the social determinants of health, which include their economic situation, whether or not they have education that supports them understanding their situation. These are called social determinants. Sometimes their cultural affiliation, sometimes their gender, their sexuality. Lots of these things can be barriers to people getting the care that they need. A very good example of that is that if you're a transgender woman and you're going into a women's clinic, you may feel more comfortable being at a women's clinic, but the questions that they may be asking you are based on questionnaires that relate to women who have been genetic females their whole life. So they're going to ask you, when did you first start your period? That doesn't apply to you, right? Or when did you first notice breast development? Stuff like that. That's geared towards genetic females is going to make you feel like you don't belong. So if you have any questions about things that are going on with your body, you may not be comfortable enough with the staff to really talk to them about it. Right? Same thing is true if you are a primarily Spanish-speaking person, for example, because we have that a lot in Los Angeles, and all of the providers are English-speaking only. There are certain cultural beliefs about health that are and aren't accepted by Western medicine. And if you bring them up and nobody's ever heard them, and you get made fun of or they get disregarded, are you really going to trust your provider? Are you really going to tell them that you're also having domestic violence issues? Maybe not, right? So you end up in this situation where holistic health, making sure that the entire person is noted and cared for, is a philosophical departure from medicine, and it usually is what we do in nursing. So in nursing, we care about the whole person. Medicine tends to be focused on disease process. And that's why these two things are two separate sciences, and why we complement each other on a care team. Because the doctor's education is really geared toward this disease process approach, and it's very important. But it is lacking certain aspects that can actually really make sure you have good outcomes, right? Same thing with like occupational and physical therapy. A lot of what they do is focused on people's employment and how they get their sense of self out of their job. And I don't know anything about that. So as a nurse, it's not helpful for me to act like that doesn't exist, but I'm not an expert. So it's good to have an OT or a PT on the team too.
Right. They complement each other too, because physical is more like the body, and then occupational is more of like everyday life.
Yeah.
So it's just like talking to people and brushing your teeth. They help out with that. But,
no, it's true. Yeah. And so this Stanford project, which is a Medicine X program, and basically what they're doing is they're disrupting the traditional norm, which is the doctor at the very top, the physician at the top, looking at disease process primarily, and being at the top of this hierarchy, which kind of inhibits communication. And they're flipping it by saying, we want to take healthcare professionals and we want to match them up with patients who really are the experts. And where this is best understood is in research, which is that whoever it is that's experiencing the phenomenon that you're interested in, they're the expert, not you. And so from this program, the idea was to meet up with somebody who has a disease that you're interested in or studying, hear their stories and background of what they've been through and what's going on. Together as a team, you identify some problem that's actually reasonably discussed, met, and approached in a month period, because we only have a few weeks to be together before we go to the conference. And that short period of time, we get mentorship. I was just recently, my team was referred to a woman who runs a very important diabetes blog and various conferences. It's something like 65 million views. So she knows a lot about diabetes, and she's very interested in kind of innovative approaches. So the program is trying to put students together. And the girl that I was assigned to be partners with has a chronic muscular degenerative disease. But speaking to her, we realized that where diabetes kind of comes into play is that her mom has diabetes. And we talked a little bit about the fact that she's an international traveler. She is a Chinese student. She is currently in Paris right now. She works for that magazine Vice, and really does a lot to highlight issues of people with disabilities. So she's right now in Paris. She actually might right now be flying back to Beijing. So she's going back to China. She has studied here in Los Angeles, maybe looking at doing a PhD at Stanford. So she's an amazing girl, but she is wheelchair bound. And she has this mom with a chronic illness who travels everywhere. So we were really quickly able to identify that traveling with insulin, with needles, and with a medication that has to be refrigerated when you're going internationally is a huge challenge.
Has she thought of taking tablets or anything?
Insulin has to be injected, because oral medication for diabetes, which only works for type 2 diabetics for a little while sometimes, and it does not work for type 1. The oral medications stimulate your pancreas to create its own insulin, but if you have total failure of what's called the beta cells in your pancreas, you cannot produce your own insulin. You have to eat it. If you were to swallow it, it would be digested by your stomach juices, basically, right? So you have to inject it. And the risk with insulin is that it can cause an immediate precipitous drop in blood pressure, or in blood sugar, that can be life-threatening. But blood sugar too high can also be life-threatening. And it is this very delicate dance that you have to do where you're balancing out your carbohydrate and protein intake with the insulin itself, and how much stress you're under, how much you've been sleeping lately, any anxiety, all of those things affect your blood sugar. So like,
what happens when your blood sugar is too high?
When your blood sugar, it is literally sugar in your blood. And so your blood gets kind of sticky and viscous. And when blood is sticky, it can lead to all sorts of things like strokes and heart attacks. It can lead to just kind of sluggish blood that's not able to get into the very small spaces, like the, not even just like capillaries, but microcapillaries. So it can lead to retinal damage. It's called diabetic retinopathy, because the little capillaries get so engorged and inflamed, and the tissues themselves get starved. So that's a problem. That can also happen in your extremities, and so it causes slower healing. Basically, it can cause the cells to die in any area where you require a lot of blood flow. And so that's why people end up getting amputations. People end up going blind. So high blood sugar is really bad for you, but it won't kill you right now. It will kill you piece by piece, and it can really lead to a pretty bad quality of life. It also damages your kidneys, because the sugar molecules themselves are pretty big, like protein molecules, and it's just bad within the nephrons themselves. But low blood sugar can kill you right now, because your brain needs about 60% of the sugar you take just to function. And if you're not feeding your cells, they will die. So a drop in blood sugar can literally immediately lead to seizures, loss of consciousness, coma, and death. So, and it can happen very, very quickly. So taking your insulin and then not having food within 15 minutes to a half an hour can be life-threatening.
So can you get low blood sugar from taking too much insulin?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a constant balancing act. So what they used to do in hospitals was have a thing called a sliding scale. So if your blood sugar was a certain number, you got a certain number of units of insulin to offset it. Because the insulin acts like a key. It opens up your cells and allows the sugar molecules to pass into them and feed the cells. If all the cells stay locked because there's not any insulin, then the sugar just stays in your bloodstream. Right. So
you really have to balance it.
Yeah, well, so you're starving to death, basically. And you're losing cardiac muscle, brain tissue. But at the same time, you're really making your blood sticky and sluggish, which is also a bad thing. So it's a delicate dance. The only other issue with insulin is that it has to remain refrigerated. And depending on the type you take, you often have to mix them. So you can, and there's a very specific way of doing it. Some insulin is fast acting, some insulin is slow acting, and a lot of people take a combination of the two. So that involves you having multiple glass vials that must remain refrigerated, and you have to be able to differentiate between the types. You have to be able to inject the air into the vials each time, and then withdraw the insulin in the right order so that you're not mixing the two, and then you have to be able to inject yourself. So it's not easy. And a lot of kids who have type 1 diabetes, they usually have insulin pumps that are permanently placed in them, and they wear it around. It's like a little machine that's kind of strapped to their side. So I think for a lot of people that I talk to in my research who are on insulin, it presents problems. But the anxiety around having low blood sugar and not ever knowing how things are going to be for you that day is a problem. But what if you're like Schwinn, who is somebody who has the opportunity to work for these major companies, major media outlets, and part of that is flying all over the world? What happens to you if you have needles that you're trying to take through airport security nowadays? What happens to you if you're trying to refrigerate things? From my perspective, the main reason that we would want to encourage people to kind of feel like they have control over this issue is that maybe you never travel your whole life. You get diagnosed with diabetes, and you're a homebody and you never want to travel, right? But just having somebody tell you, here's how you travel internationally. Here's like an information card you could use, or here's blah, blah, blah. It puts that thought into your mind. The same way that when you're young, if people go like, what college are you going to? It doesn't really help you get to college, but it implants a seed in your mind that it's possible for you to go to college. That's going to change how you view your whole world. So because I care about mental health when it comes to chronic illness and diabetes specifically, I'm interested in giving people a tool that helps them see themselves as more able and capable to go and do things and not feel limited, right? So I know that was a lot to take in. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. I'm just writing down all the notes so I can refer back to it, also with the recording. And I was, for the mental health mental and chronic health, I was thinking of something for like the syringes yesterday. I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but I was thinking, you know how you get the official transcripts from high school and you have like the seal on it, and if you break it, it's not official anymore?
Oh, that's very smart.
Yeah, so then I was thinking, what if we get like the syringes, we put it inside a cooler and put like a barcode or like
that's a really good idea. And I think this is the idea, is that that's actually really fantastic. But when we do any sort of product development or research, we really have to think about the fact that return on investment is the most important driver of change in how we handle medical care. Like, I've worked in insurance for many years, and you can have really legit research supporting things. You can have really great intentions and a lot of background from patients. Until you're able to establish cause and effect related to a specific intervention and return on investment is considered, it's not something that ever gets off the ground. Because there are many, many interventions that we could do for anything, really, but they need to be tested, and they need to prove that they work before they're instituted in a large way, and they need to prove that they're needed. Because we can sit in a room and invent all sorts of things that probably make sense logically, but may not be what the consumers even care about. So this is the discussion. The same thing that happened with Schwinn is that I said, we were talking about creating these cards, these information cards that you could carry with you. And she, I don't know if you got to see, she added her interview with her mom about what happened to them. She had a horrific experience one time when they were traveling with insulin. So we thought about doing these information cards, having them in a few different languages, but the first thing you want to do is not reinvent the wheel. So step one, whenever we're doing any sort of project, is a review of the literature. That's kind of the formal name of when you're in research. We call it a review of the literature, or sometimes they'll call it the state of the science. So we want to know kind of what exists now. And so we thought it was really important to take the time to see, do these cards exist? Are there other solutions? And is the problem that there are solutions but nobody knows about them? You know, because if that's the case, then our project can be about how do we get this information out there? How do we publicize that this stuff exists? Because just getting more people access and awareness is a good solution. So that's the first part. The second part is that as part of the everyone included piece of the Stanford project, we want to hear people's actual stories. We don't want to tell them what we think the problem is. We want them to tell us what their experience has told them the problem is. And in doing that, it really requires that we look at not just the numeric data, it's called quantitative data, but we look at the qualitative data, which is what people are saying, interviews, their stories and perspectives on their experience. And we value and legitimize that sort of data as being as important, if not more so, when it comes to inventing a real intervention. So we designed the SurveyMonkey survey, right, to try to get, now there's some questions in there that are questions that are quantitatively measured, like the first 4 questions or something are, you know, one of these that we can average out percentages for. But those were just to get heads in the right space so that they would answer the next 3 questions, which are all narrative spaces that they can actually tell what happened to them, what their experience was. And that's really what we care about. We also, in doing the lit review, made an effort to find articles that have qualitative methodological approaches. So if your methods are you were trying to interview people, we value that above maybe the NIH data that says the number of people that have a diabetic emergency in there, right? They're both important, but for this project, the voices of the people are what we care about. So step 1 is review of the literature. Step 2 is getting our own original data, which is the SurveyMonkey survey.
Well, how are we doing on that?
I think we have either 4 submissions. Not great, but it's because we haven't really decided how big we're going to make this project. Sometimes designing a project and getting it ready for the next phase is worthwhile. This could very easily be a dissertation project. And so we don't want to make it so big that we can't do it in a month. What we may come up with, which is the next part, is given everything that we know now, deciding what do we want our final products to look like. Is the final product writing up a literature review that we then get published, and then all these recommendations are out in the scientific ether, and anybody who wants to do a dissertation can pull these ideas and test it? Sometimes it's valuable just to get published. Is it to create a mock-up card that displays what we think should be there based on all of the data we found? Is it a policy or a white paper on, based on all of this information, this is our recommendation? Now, we've actually kind of taken a step in that direction with, Win is actually writing to pharmaceutical companies in China that produce insulin to talk to them about what do they feel their responsibility is in terms of this. Should they be creating information packets and putting them in with the medication itself? So when you get your medication, you've already got your card, right? So he's kind of exploring that piece of it. At the end of the day, hopefully what we'll do is give you kind of an understanding of what a lit review looks like. And then we will create a poster that we can present at least the UCLA Research Days conference. We're going to be presenting slides at Stanford, which is great. It kind of gives people access, but it also really just kind of opens you up to the fact that there are a lot of different ways of looking at things. But we all use the scientific method. We have to make sure that everything we do is rigorous and responsible. And when you go on to become a physician, it's important to remember that your perspective and view is one perspective, and that it doesn't always accurately reflect the patient. And at the end of the day, they are what's important, you know? So anyway, so that's kind of where we are.
Okay, so I'm trying to see which way I should be going, because I was thinking of like this grand scale, but we're trying to do it smaller, not too intense. I was thinking of making like some kind of like program where they have scanners to scan the material. But
I mean, but I think these sorts of, but those ideas actually can be written up in our recommendation section. So you'll have the literature review, you do the background, kind of the relevance of the problem. You discuss what your methodology was. We'll be talking about how we searched for articles, and we decided to include non-peer-reviewed publications that people have just posted online, because that's kind of the pulse of what's happening.
Right.
So we'll talk about everything we did. We'll talk about what we found, and you and I have already discussed a little bit that a lot of the articles talk about the timing of using
definitely the time zone,
which means it's very physician-focused. But it does make me feel like maybe we should give people access to an app where you simply type in the hours that you usually take your insulin, and it adjusts internationally and updates your time, right? Like something like that that's very simple. So we'll talk about what our findings were, and then we'll talk in a little discussion about where we think it should go. That's the next paragraph. But the last paragraph really is about our recommendation. And that's where having this official seal, maybe educating the airlines, maybe doing an app that is easy to access or free for people who are on insulin. All of these different recommendations then get published and go into the literature. So if you decide when you're doing your second year or third year of medical school that you want to get a master's in public health too, because I know they offer different things, you can go back and say, I'm expanding off this original project that we did. I'm going to create and test this app. Or I'm going to see how much it would cost for us to do this official seal and who would be allowed to do it. Is it something as simple as a stamp that's distributed to physicians' offices, endocrinologists, and they stamp the insulin? Like, you yourself could then go test one of these interventions. And you would have, you'd have this experience plus the years of your clinical rotations to kind of inform the idea even more.
Right. So for this project, are we not taking into account like legal issues or anything?
Well, so this is not an experiment, and this is not a study, because when you're doing any sort of human subject testing, you need something called IRB approval, which is basically an ethical review board that is affiliated with either a university or a large hospital system. And the board will review your plans, everything that you're going to do with these people, to make sure that you're not hurting them in any way. Because this is not because it's not that. It's literally a project, and it's a pilot project. We're just testing kind of the, not even testing, we're just exploring what exists right now, making some observations and making some suggestions, which is why we are not collecting anyone's demographic data. You'll notice there's nothing that says, are you male, female, what's your ethnicity? Nothing on the survey, because we don't want that. We're not keeping the data. So once we collect the data at the end of next week, I think, then we delete all of the findings so that it doesn't exist anywhere. There's no database for it. So everyone's confidentiality is maintained. So in larger studies, yes, what you're talking about is really critical, and it has to be considered. And you would probably do a separate chapter on kind of the legality of people's rights when they're in an airport environment. But for a project like this is just a very small piece. So.
Okay.
It's a good question, though.
Yeah, because I was thinking a lot about like terrorism and everything, and also why people are so strict at airports, checking the insulin pumps and everything. But they talk about that in the articles as well.
So here's another thought, though. On the poster that we create, you'll end up being third author, right? Which is great. But if you want to create your own poster, your own like research project, this is kind of a tradition in science, which is that you have a primary investigator who is usually like, you know, a doctor somewhere, and you'll work in their lab, and you become an assistant. You're like a research assistant in their lab, and you help them study their bigger issue, but they help you carve off some small piece that just you own, that's just your interest. And you use their data and use their advice and their information to help you build your own project. That's essentially the PhD process. It's you proving that you can do something independently, and able, you know, that you're able to advance the science in that same area. So off of this project, once we've reviewed the literature and we've talked about common themes and things, then if you find something that is specific to, I want to look at the potential impact of legal restrictions resulting from terrorist acts and how they affect people traveling with insulin, that is your separate project where you are the first author. You know, I and Schwinn would probably be second authors. We'd review it for you. You would create your own poster, and you would take that to a conference and present it. And that gets your name out there. It gets people seeing some kind of cutting edge stuff. And it really does make you much more marketable for scholarships and grants and things that are focused on chronic illness, if that's what you want to do. Or policy, which is another great place to go. So, but yeah, that's literally how you start in research. That's exactly how I started. I was working with a woman who was doing a dietary intervention for older African-American women in the Willowbrook area with diabetes. And I said to her, what if we sent them cell phone messages, like texted them to remind them of stuff, to remind them to do this or that or that? And so mine was, you know, a pilot project implementing a cell phone based intervention to see if it changed the amount of, you know, to see if it changed their dietary compliance, right? So it was my own project. She had this larger NIH funded study, but I did my own little separate project, and it was my first foray into research, and it literally is one of the things that got me into UCLA. So,
Right on. Awesome.
So it's a good idea, and I think it's something you can consider if you have time. It's definitely something that shows that you're proactive about being a student, about, you know, being a curious person who wants to do it responsibly. So.
Well, I was thinking about that too. Yeah, because there's the HANIC conference coming up, and we have to let the honors program know if we're going to participate or not. So I'm thinking that, yeah.
I'm familiar
with
that.
So I'm thinking of doing it.
I think you should consider it. If you're, there's always lots of conferences coming up. And the thing about HANIC is that they're so STEM focused that the only time they really include medicine is when they're talking about devices, because they're very engineering focused. But there are, there's a lot of conferences that you can go to that are very research-based. At the very least, we will be at the UCLA Research Days. So that's the thing. So, but yeah, the other thing about conferences is that usually presenting a poster, it has to have not been presented anywhere else. So posters are what you do for cutting edge results to get them out right away. Publications are papers you write that you submit and get published sometimes after you've already presented at a conference. But usually you can only present a poster once. Although some conferences will say, we'll take anybody. Even if you've already presented this, we'll take it. And that's a good way of kind of getting out there and getting to different places. So I don't want to take too much of your time. That's kind of where we are right now. Xuan is going to, I believe, Beijing. And so I'm going to be in contact with her. They don't have Google there. They're not allowed.
Why do they not have it?
Because Chinese government restrictions. So instead of accessing our shared drive, she's going to have to switch over to email. So I'm going to be emailing her updates. She is checking with the pharmaceutical companies. I am doing a review of the literature. We are continuing to push the SurveyMonkey surveys, right? Okay. So what I plan to have done by probably the middle of next week is to have printed out all these articles. So this, just to show you kind of what I'll do, is I'll go in and I'll print the article, and you'll start to notice that the articles are arranged in the same way. There's always an abstract at the beginning. That's the first section, and that gives you
summary of the whole article, right?
It's like the summary, right? And then all articles should have exactly what we talked about: a background, right? This is more of a white paper. I can find you one. They'll have kind of the background of what's happening. They will have what their methods were, right? In this case, they did different case study scenarios. They'll do their findings, and then they'll have advice or recommendations, right? So what we want to do is go through the articles that are in that. I just revised the references list. We want to just read them and see, who are these articles written for? Are they written for patients, or are they written for physicians? Are they written in easy to understand language? So if these articles are making recommendations, but they're using very complicated language, it's probably not for a layperson, right? So then what is the odds that they're going to get access to that information? That's kind of important. And then what are they identifying as the most important concerns? Because what they identified in these articles, as I've seen, has been a time zone issue. And then general advice about being diabetic. But what we got from the interview was that people had a hard time keeping things refrigerated. And that's very different than this. So, and there were language barriers, right? I didn't notice that mentioned in here. So what the literature says versus what individuals say, that's two different things. So anyway, so I'm going to keep going through this. And if you want to, probably the easiest thing for you to do is to print them and just underline what you think the main points are. Like, the main point of this article is this, and then who you think the article is, who is the intended audience.
An audience.
Yeah, and if they have any recommendations, you might want to pay attention to that, because if all of the articles are making the same basic recommendations, then we can have a pretty good sense of what the current state of the science is. And if our interviewees are saying something totally different, it's because all of this science was done in a bubble. A bunch of researchers talking to each other and never talking to the patients. And that can happen.
I don't know if it was in the Google Docs, but there was an article or a blog from the TSA. And if you scroll all the way down, there's all these comments. And
that's good.
Yeah, so there was a lot of comments on their experiences and talking about how the policies, they never update it, or they never do another blog talking about the policies.
That's awesome. If you see anything like that, screenshot it for me. Okay. And that way we can add it, because we're not going to get access to these people unless we do a big study and get IRB approval and really invest some time and money into getting this information out so that we can get feedback from people. So an easy way to do it is to look at the comments.
Okay,
That's
sweet.
really smart.
I just scrolled down. I was like, okay, is there any more?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Okay, so when do you want to meet next week? Do you want to do Tuesday?
Tuesday would be good. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll do Tuesday like at 9, like last time, and we'll
Same
spend
place?
same place. We'll spend a half an hour on this, and then the rest of the time on your essay questions.
Okay, sounds
And
good.
you don't have to have them done or written up. Just think about them. Even
Okay.
like having cards with bullet points is helpful, I think.
I have that for all the questions that I was thinking of doing, and now I have one for the required questions. So I think
Cool.
we're pretty solid for next week.
Good. As long as we're just like continuing to push forward, that's what's most important. Because November will be here before you know it.
Yeah.
But it's okay. We still have time. But it's amazing how quick it like runs up on you. So.
That's true.
All right.
Just like finishing high school, that was quick.
Yeah. It's all of a sudden it's right there. All right. Well, have a good day. Bug me if you need anything. I'm going to update notes on what we talked about. And yeah, send me any screenshots or anything that you find interesting. Just go ahead and email them to me.
Okay. Sounds good. See you next week.
Cool. Bye.
Adios.